So the first thing to do when you're handling a blade is to cover it up with one of these sheaths. And then we're gonna, before putting the handle on, we're gonna use a rag with alcohol and use the 91% or higher alcohol to really clean off this handle tang. And this one's already been sanded. You can see the scratch pattern from the sanding. So before gluing on and before wiping alcohol, these get sanded. And we're going to wipe off the handles too. You can see these have been sanded also, so the handles get sanded first also. In order to glue up the two-piece handle, Western style handles to the Western style blade tang, we're going to use this G-Flex stick, which has already been pre-prepared into the cartridges shown in another video, and we're going to use a static mixing nozzle. So the first thing to do is to remove the cap, set it aside, and put on the static mixing nozzle. This cartridge is going to go into an epoxy gun like this one, so you can slide it in here, and then it's ready to go. So you just have to have the air. This one is air powered, so you just have to have the air connected to it, and you'll see when I pull the trigger, you'll see the epoxy start squeezing out here. Okay, I'm going to start up here, and I'm going to start spreading the epoxy, kind of doing a zigzag pattern. Come back here, do the center, come down, do the bottom. Set the epoxy gun aside. I'm going to take a popsicle stick and spread this epoxy. Spread a thin layer, and relatively thin layer. We want to leave enough so it can squeeze out. And we want it to be as bubble free in the middle as possible. Okay, now turn over to the other side, spread the excess a little bit. Do the same thing on the other side. Spread that around. Try to get an even layer. Okay, so now we're going to take this sheet of little spacers that I laser cut. I'm going to remove 6 of them from the sheet. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Pop out the insides, little donut holes. Pop those out. Set those here, we don't forget about them. And now we're going to put these 1/2 inch length spacers. So I'm going to squirt a little bit of epoxy on the end of these. So when I put them into the holes, it's going to spread epoxy around, and it's also going to epoxy the screw in. So it's good. I want it to go into the threads too, so it retains the screw, and I don't have to put any thread locker afterwards. Now I'm going to take 3 of these washers and put them on the end here. And put these, I'm gonna put it through the top set of holes because there's kind of two sets of holes, and the lower set is for a different style handle. The top set is for these kind of standard thick style handles. So I'm put through the top set of holes. There we go. And now I'm going to take the other 3 washers and put them on top of the standoffs. Then I'm going to wipe my hands with the alcohol rag. Just to make sure I have clean hands. It helps work better. And then put the other half on there. Now I'm going to put the screws in, and hopefully the screws are the right size, or the screw head's the right size. We won't have to, if we have to adjust that, I'll have to show how to adjust it. Some of the screw heads, oh no. Some of the screw heads, the black screws, are washed out or discoloration, and I don't like to use those. I like to use the ones that are nice and dark. So as I screw these 2 sides of the handles together, the epoxy is going to squeeze out. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare another blade tang, so I can move that epoxy straight to the other blade tang. If you're just doing one, you'll have to scrape the epoxy off and stick it into a container. But if I'm doing more than one, I can go ahead and move it over. So the first thing to do when you're handling a blade is to cover it up with one of these sheaths. And then we're gonna, before putting the handle on, we're gonna use a rag with alcohol and use the 91% or higher alcohol to really clean off this handle tang. And this one's already been sanded. You can see the scratch pattern from the sanding. So before gluing on and before wiping alcohol, these get sanded. And we're going to wipe off the handles too. You can see these have been sanded also, so the handles get sanded first also. Now I'm going to go back and keep tightening this until this Torx limiting screwdriver, until it just like twists and it doesn't allow the screw to go any further. One thing I want to make sure to do is that the screws are flush with the surface, and with the wood, a lot of times you can just kind of overdrive the screw into it. With some of the plastics, sometimes you can overdrive the screw, but sometimes you can't just overdrive the screw. You have to actually remove the screws and then use this chamfer tool here to make the chamfer just a tiny bit bigger to fit the screw. Always keep your hands clean as you're doing this with the alcohol rag. Helps to reduce the spread of epoxy. You really want your gloves to always be clean. If you see any epoxy on your gloves, wipe it off. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and just take this with a popsicle stick and move it onto this other Tang, so I'm not wasting any glue. And it's usually enough for one whole side. Now I'm going to move on to cleaning this handle up. So to do that, use these little pieces of cut material, cut approximately like 1 inch by 3 to 4 inches or so, and soak them thoroughly in alcohol, like that. And once you wipe as much as you can off with the stick, then you can start wiping with the alcohol soaked cloth. And the idea is that you're gonna keep folding this to not spread the epoxy everywhere. Just keep folding it over. And get this corner down here. Get a fresh one when you're done with that one. And now you can actually like wipe back and forth. If you've removed enough of the resin, you can do more of a wiping action. Get down in here again, get rid of that. Now we're going to start moving to like wiping the surface, because we had some epoxy in the screws here. Go over here, wipe this surface. I'm going to grab a new alcohol cloth in a second. You can set it down, but be careful that there's no resin where you're setting it down, that the resin is cleaned up. And check the screws. The screws are clean. Don't want some resin sitting inside the screws. like I talked about, this screw head here is kind of black, whitish. It's not very nice. So let me go ahead and change that screw. I'm gonna clean the tip on my screwdriver. Before I do that, wash my hands with the alcohol rag. Clean the screwdriver handle. Grab another screw that's nice and put a little dab of epoxy on that screw to lock the threads. Now I'm going to take off the protector. And clean up the blade a little bit. If I got resin or alcohol on the blade, clean that up. And I don't want some epoxy to stay on the blade. It'll be hard to clean off later. Be careful not to cut yourself, of course. And clean off those screws, the screw that I replaced. And that's it. Now, every once in a while, during the curing process, I usually come back and check like hour or 2 hours, and there might be some bubbles that have risen in between the connection between the tang and the handle scales. So then I use the alcohol wipes to remove those bubbles and kind of polish that down with the alcohol wipe. This handle will also still need a wax finish to it afterwards once everything is dried. But there we go, that's glued up. So now I'm going to move on to completing this other knife. And it looks like there's probably almost enough resin on this side, epoxy on this side. I'm just gonna put a little bit there, then move over here and do this side here. Okay, again, take the popsicle stick, spread that glue around gently. Don't want to introduce more air bubbles. Then put it in here. And the reason we don't want air bubbles in there is because if there's any air bubbles, they will compress and then squeeze out resin as it's curing. And that's what causes the bubbles to form. Do the same thing, get those 6 little spacers. What these spacers do is they leave a little bit of space for the epoxy to live in. Otherwise, if you don't use the spacers, you're trying to compress that epoxy. When you're clamping the handles together, you're trying to compress that epoxy all the way to 0, and the epoxy has to live somewhere, so a lot of it's gonna squeeze out, or a lot more is gonna squeeze out. It's gonna want to all squeeze out, and it creates basically like a spring, and then it just keeps squeezing out rather than rather than squeeze, like right now with the spacers, it clamps until it hits the spacers, and then it doesn't, the epoxy, there's a space for the epoxy to stay, so it squeezes out and it stops squeezing out. But if you don't use these spacers, then it clamps all the way until it wants to be completely flat, but there's still epoxy in there. So over time, it's just going to keep squeezing out and keep squeezing out. It was something I learned very early on. So now we're going to take the epoxy gun and squirt some epoxy on these spacers. Call them spacers. They're standoffs, threaded standoffs. Got some epoxy on my fingers, so I'm going to clean those off. Now, take 3 of these spacers, put them on here. Put them in the top row, put the holes, put the pins inside the top row. There we go. And now right away, before I forget, put on these 3 spacers here. And then clean off my fingers. See, I got some on the lid. That's why it's important to keep everything clean, because otherwise it spreads. Put the other half of the handle on. I'm going to use black screws again for this. And I think we've already checked the fit of these screws and the handles so that they fit flush. Flip it over. If a screw is just spinning in the void, then go ahead and flip it over and try the other side. Sometimes you need to use a screwdriver on both sides, but that doesn't happen very often. Okay, so now it's starting to get to the point where, see, I'm turning the screwdriver and it's not, the end is not turning, it's just clicking. You do want to be careful about not overdriving it in there too much. If it's starting to go in, and even though it's not clicking, you can probably stop. You can probably stop driving it. You can feel when it gets tight. The clicking is just a kind of last resort. Like, this is, do not tighten past this point. Okay, cleaning the hands again. I'm going to grab a new blade. So I keep a wet alcohol rag that's relatively clean in another box. Oh, I forgot. I need to put the cover on this one to protect it. So clean off that Tang with the alcohol. Clean off the handle. And again, we're going to move this epoxy from one to the next. The epoxy starts to get thicker the longer you work this, especially the more you move from one to the next. It kind of just ends up getting thicker and thicker, and it's still workable. Just you'll notice it start to get thicker. So there's a lot of squeeze out here, so I can probably move some to the back side. As long as I make sure I have full coverage on the one side, I can go ahead and move the back side here. Then I want to get near the front of the handle too. Pick up as much as I can with the popsicle stick so it makes less wiping up to do later. Okay, now it's time to grab some of these strips again. Grab one and soak it with alcohol. Start wiping the epoxy off the handle. Really carefully wipe off here near the front. And same on the other side. Attempting to not leave any residue here. And then start wiping the surface of the handle. Now you want to strike a balance of wetness of the wiping tissue, because if you put too much alcohol in it, it's just like running alcohol out of it, then it won't be good either. It makes it difficult to use. It spreads the epoxy everywhere. You want it to be well soaked, but not sopping wet. Okay, so now I'm going to take this out of the case here. Clean my gloves again. Toss that. I'm going to clean off the blade. And now I'm going to do one final cleaning pass of the handle. Kind of polish up the blade a little bit just to get any residue off of it.